Okay.
Hello and welcome
Go.
to On the Edge. Hello and welcome to On the Edge, Conversations in ... I'm Dr. Jonas Moses, and this week we are going to be talking about robotics. I will have a guest with me, Dr. Ellen Wagner, and I will introduce him just momentarily. But first I want to point out that this is a brand new iteration of this On the Edge series. In fact, it's so new that a lot of different things have changed over the last 10 years since the last live show. In one instance, I'm in Mexico City, and joining me is Dr. Wagner from Pennsylvania, and my another guest is here from Scandinavia, and my engineer is in Florida. Very, very different platform than we've had in the past, which was studio-based. And that's the digital age in which we live. Joining me right now is Dr. Ellen Wagner. And thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Wagner. I did want to take a moment just to introduce you. Dr. Wagner is the Assistant Professor of Aerospace Engineering at Penn State University. He is also a research associate at Penn State's Rock Ethics Institute. I can't tell you how pleased I am that you could join us this hour. And with your kind permission, could I call you Alan?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jonas, for having me.
Very well. You know, there's an abundance that we can talk about. There's so much going on in robotics these days. And every time I turn around, there's a robotic application. It's a robotic application for innovation for healthcare, and let's face it, we'll call the drones a kind of a robot controlled by human beings thus far. And so we could talk about a lot of different aspects of robotics and run out of time before we run out of topics. So let's focus on a few things. You do focus a great deal in your own work on the ethics involved in robotics, and specifically robots and their role in society. I believe you teach a course, in fact, to Penn State students on robotics and their role in society. And I have to ask, given the fact that you have a PhD in computer science, why robots?
Well, I think robots and artificial intelligence are extremely interesting topics in the sense that they have the opportunity to not only tell us about how to create and engineer a technology, but also to understand something about ourselves. For example, to develop the software that includes a robot with intelligence and the ability to interact with a wide variety of people in a large number of circumstances, you really need to know something about how humans interact, what their preferences are, what their nuances are. And so it offers a large sort of way to look at human psychology and to test out new kinds of psychology as well.
When I think of a robot, I get two very disparate images in my mind. One is the Robbie robot from like Lost in Space movie of 1999, and the other is you know, an engineered robot in a mass manufacturing facility building cars, for example. These are both robots, and I just mentioned that you do discuss drones, for example, and look at the ethical implications of human-drone interactions. So obviously, you know, drones are a very, very different kind of robot. We have robotics in our cars that we drive, smart chips in the cars that may control in some ways if we're going to crash. It helps us avert the crash, and that interaction there is probably robotic in nature. And when we walk through a building, different things swing out of our ways. And so what would you say is the classical definition of a robot?
So robots are typically defined by two aspects. One is embodiment. They have a physical presence in the real world and the ability to alter things in the real world physically, by movement, by touching, with arms, or even without arms. Another is situated. So they take sensory information from the world around them and use that information to make decisions about how to interact with the world. So these are the general characteristics, I would say, that are almost most roboticists agree upon. Now, there are certainly some fringe cases. For example, is your house a robot because it perceives the air temperature and alters its, maybe the furnace to increase the temperature? That's a little bit borderline. But generally, people are talking about physical entities that receive information, perception from the environment.
So when, based on what you're saying then, when I think of the differentiations that you've made, must a robot have an intelligence of its own to be classed in this way, or can it be pre-programmed to do what it's doing?
So once we have robots, there's a further distinction, which would be autonomous versus non-autonomous, or remote control. So remote control robots tend to be ones that are obviously controlled by some outside observer. And that's an area of research, but the area I focus on is autonomous robots, robots that are ideally intelligently making their own decisions and interacting with people and the world around them, using either their experience or planning techniques, or possibly even just reacting to the environment, but doing it on their own.
Good. So let's focus then on autonomous robots, which I think is probably the vast majority of what occupies the minds of people when they think about robots in society. You are teaching a class on robots and their role in society, and I'll be curious to know, I know I'm excited in one moment about having robots around and interacting with them, a la, one movie, futurist movie or another sci-fi movie. I think a lot of people experience a certain amount of fear and trepidation, uncertainty. Mm-hmm. What kinds of things do your students ask you about robots and autonomous robots? What do you hear from your students?
Well, we've had several discussions in courses about robots and economics. Specifically, will robots impact employment? Will the advent of robots take away jobs? Will it result in fewer prospects? Will it result in will robots result in greater inequality? And the students tend to react more optimistically, I would say, than I would have expected them to. They tend to point out that most technology results in a net increase in employment, not net decrease. So that's a positive. It's positive that they're optimistic about it. The research is a little bit unclear at this point, though.
When you teach your course, what are the kinds of things that you're sharing with your students about robots in society? What do you want them to know?
Well, a couple of things. One, I want them to understand that they play a role in shaping how robots enter and impact our society. For example, they'll help decide whether or not privacy trumps robotic observations. There's been some recent, perhaps concerning uses of robots, maybe in contrast to privacy. A recent example would be this is not necessarily a robot, but a recent example is a person's pacemaker was used to track them and put them at the scene of a crime. That raises all sorts of issues related to people with artificial prosthetics also might potentially have tracking mechanisms. And so does that mean that anyone with the prosthetic would then put themselves at greater danger of being tracked? Another example would be the Amazon Alexa robot, which has also been used to provide voice recordings at the home of individuals to determine emergency. But again, it provides a possibility that voice recordings in your own home could potentially be used in these types of environments. I want them to be knowledgeable.
Now you are just circling back, an assistant professor of aerospace engineering, and of course, you know, as a scientist, I'm kind of a sci-fi nerd, and I think back to right before I began grad school, and had an opportunity to work on an artificial intelligence at a university that was going to be developing the Robonaut for the shuttle program, and they were very interested in how the robot would see and edge discrimination and things like that at the time. Because you're an aerospace engineering program, let's talk a little bit about these kinds of robots in space exploration. At what point, let's go to the very deep end. At what point does an autonomous robot become an individual with rights and for example, the right not to be put in harm's way?
So the really very interesting question, when does a robot have a sort of right of refusal? Is that sort of a question?
Yes.
The question. There's no real answer out there at this point, but a lot of people would argue that when a robot demonstrates agency and intentionality, it has its own motivations, its own goals in the world, at that point, it has to be considered for some type of right. Now, this is not necessarily a full adult human rights model. It might be children's rights, it might be a sort of animal rights model, business rights model. But the point being is that once a robot demonstrates intentionality and having its own goals in the world, this is a sort of harbinger that these things may be worth considering for rights. Now, I will point out that that's obviously not a universally agreed upon sort of threshold. A recent European Commission has suggested that Europe should explore the possibility of having an electronic personhood, which is sort of economic liability right now. They really did not put many conditions on that electronic personhood at all.
Okay. Hold that thought. We're going to go to a commercial break. We will be right back with Dr. Ellen Wagner. This is On the Edge, Conversations in ... I'm Dr. Jonas Moses, and stay tuned. About 30 seconds right now.
You got 30 seconds, and I'll let you know when you got 10
I want to
seconds.
follow this track. Yeah, I want to follow this track, Ellen, because seems like we're on the sci-fi edge. I'm given to understand that different people, different organs, different development groups are on the fringe of artificial intelligence, and I don't know what I hate to say sentience, self-awareness is a touchy-feely sort of a thing. But we're at that point where we have to ask the question of what happens when.
Yeah.
And so I do want to hear what you know about that, not what you think about it, but what you know about it and what conversations you're aware of, because I think that that's a very interesting place to go, and it will take us around to medical applications and so on, and emergency management. I'm waiting for our engineer to tell me when we have. Okay, 10 seconds. Okay, so we'll be Hello and welcome back to On the Edge, Conversations in ... I'm Dr. Jonas Moses, and with me this hour, Dr. Ellen Wagner. We are talking about robotics this hour, and when we went to commercial break, we were just getting into the conversation about when is an autonomous robot self-aware, or is there such a thing as an autonomous self-aware robot? And let's go back to that conversation. You were in the middle of telling me about a European discussion about this. Please pick that up.
Certainly. A European Commission sort of researched and examined and suggested that the EU consider the possibility of offering, presenting a type of electronic personhood in which a robot or some sort of electronic being could exist with their own rights. Now, this European Commission, I should note, has focused more on the sort of issues surrounding liability. This is obviously a very important issue. For example, if an autonomous car crashes into someone, who's liable? Is it the car company? Is it the driver that was asleep in the back? Or is it possible that we could actually sanction the car itself? But that brings up a large number of very difficult, very not well understood types of problems. Among them,
sorry, go ahead.
Among them, how do you sanction an electronic being or a robot at all?
Well, and perhaps we should, I'm going to ask you to reiterate, you know, what are we talking about, sentience here, true self-awareness? There's some less than that. Are we talking about an animal, a comparable intellect to an animal or a child, or, you know, and where beings are not held as responsible. If a child commits a crime, we tend to look at, you know, the background. You know, what are the parents like? What is the environment like? If an animal, if a dog bites a human, you know, what was the situation? So when an autonomous robot commits a crime, or you know, does something as you like a self-driving car causes an accident, how do we define that intelligence, that self-awareness?
Well, so that's a fabulous question. You know, I think most robotics researchers would agree that robots currently are below most animals in terms of ability, thought, ability to react to novel problems in the world. They're not even at the level of say, a smart dog in most cases. They're getting there. You know, these things are improving, but you know, they are not even quite at the level of a cat or a dog. So, given those limitations, it's difficult to imagine how you could sanction, you know, these types of entities. They have no sentience. They have no consciousness. They have no intentionality. At this point, they're simply running a set of pre-programmed, oftentimes rules, which generally guide their behavior and attempt to the extent possible, react to novel situations in the world. Given that extremely limited sort of intelligence, these things really are simply not at the point where any sort of rights model probably makes sense.
And yet, given the swiftness with which we are innovating these days, the impossible rapidity of, every 5 months a new smartphone is coming out, every 3 months a new laptop, every time I turn around there's another iteration of a smart product And isn't the same true in robotics? Isn't this fluid and ongoing in a way that we really have to be looking at this now? I'm asking you uneducated questions and observation. At what point do we decide that we need to address this?
So another very good question. I would say that your point is perfectly well taken. The science is moving very fast, and even for someone like myself who's involved in the research on a daily basis, I'm often surprised when I go to conferences and things that I didn't think would be possible for at least 5 to 10 years are possible 6 months later. So I would point out, in complete agreement, that we need to start these conversations now. We should think about them thoroughly, and most importantly, before the technology becomes available. We don't want to have to make some sort of snap or rash decision just because some technology was born. We'd much rather have some sort of philosophical, if nothing else, sort of basis for assigning a rights model to a robot before that robot exists. So
when I think of, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
When I think of just absorbing what you just said, then, are you aware of any organizations or any concerted effort, industry, government, agency, public policy organ that is investigating this now in an active way?
There are several agencies that are investigating the robot rights at the moment. Of course, there's the European Commission that I mentioned. There is also a Korean commission, the name of which escapes me. I believe that they created a charter which was meant to be a sort of outline for future robot rights. There are at least a couple of other sort of low-level organizational methods or attempts to look at this. But it's really difficult before the technology is here in some sense, because you have to project as to what the technology will be like. Specifically with respect to the Korean charter, one of the statements in the charter, I believe, states that a robot should not deceive a person. On the surface, that sounds like something that would make sense. This is a charter for how robots should be meant to ethically act. But when you consider how often we deceive each other, it's difficult to imagine a social robot which doesn't also tell you that your shoes look nice, even if they don't.
Touche. And that's an intriguing. I guess there's a dichotomy here for me, because you said social robot, something that interacts socially, and I know humans in a laboratory setting or in an engineering setting who don't have the capacity to look down and say your shoes look nice. They're human beings. So the question in my mind is that an elemental aspect of robotics, of the autonomous robot? Is it important for our robots, these autonomous robots, to be social beings?
Absolutely. And based on psychology and neuroscience, we are not born with all the intelligence that keeps us alive through our first 10 years, right? We have parents that guide our behavior, to prevent us from making serious mistakes in the world early on when they can be most damaging. And that is a social interaction. You learn through social environments often and most typically. Now, humans and robots differ in many ways, but it's challenging to imagine a robot that doesn't learn, at least to some extent, socially.
Okay, well, then, let's tread a little further out on that thin ice and say, at what point do you allow an autonomous robot intelligence decide whether or not to apply ethics and morals?
So a great, interesting question.
Or ought that be hardwired? Ought we not hardwire and say, this is a fundamental, you know, like there, below this foundation, there's nothing. You got to stick with this, okay? So at ground zero, we say all robots who are autonomous, and I'll say who are autonomous, must be ethical, moral beings, awareness, and must apply those. That's a litmus for social interaction.
Okay, so what you're describing is something called machine ethics, which is the exploration of how you develop robots which are ethical. There are sort of two major branches of machine ethics right now. One are explicitly ethical machines or robots. The idea behind these are that you do exactly what you said. You pre-program these systems with a well-defined set of moral or ethical rules that they then follow that prevents unethical behavior and allows only ethical behavior. This sort of approach was, we were one of the first groups, my advisor actually, Ron Arkin and I, looking at how you could possibly do this in military robots. The idea behind that is that you could actually have a robot on the battlefield which you pre-program with the rules of war, the Geneva Convention, the rules of engagement, and ideally that robot would guarantee that it doesn't commit an atrocity. It wouldn't get angry, it would simply follow those rules and, you know, be a good soldier. The limitation, though, of explicit...
Sorry.
What's that?
I think that I'm going to go ahead and we're going to go to a commercial break here. We will be right back. We are speaking with Dr. Ellen Wagner about robotics this week, and you are watching On the Edge, Conversations in ... I'm Dr. Jonas Moses. Hold that thought. We'll be right back.
Okay, very good. 30 seconds.
Alan, this is interesting stuff, and you know, if you have some specific things that you want to get to or in this topic, now's the time to tell me, because I'm happy to go there.
Yeah, so what I was going to say is I'm going to go on to the disadvantage of explicitly ethical robots, and then I'm going to talk about the second group, which is implicitly ethical robots, which are more on the edge, very interesting, but a little bit more sci-fi, but are currently being explored by researchers right now, including myself.
We are breaking up a little bit, John. I'm having some problems. I don't know if you are, but I'm experiencing some delays and whatnot. And I wonder if that's a band.
No, it's the Wi-Fi connection that you have.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, is anybody having?
We just have to. Well, it kind of goes to the lowest bandwidth. Whoever has the lowest bandwidth. So we'll work on that before the next show of having a good cable connection.
Absolutely.
We'll do what we can for this one. Okay, 10 seconds, Jonas. And take it when you're ready.
All right. Hello and welcome back to On the Edge, Conversations in ... I'm Dr. Jonas Moses. With me this week is Dr. Ellen Wagner. Dr. Wagner is at Penn State University. He is an ethicist on robots and the relationship between robots and humans. And so we are this hour talking about robotics. And we had just been, as we went away to a commercial break, talking a little bit about ethical robots versus, you know, as hardwired versus freewheeling, out there on the edge kind of, I can do whatever I want robot programming. So take it away, Dr. Wagner. Alan, please, your thought process is intriguing, and I want to hear what you were going to say next.
So I was mentioning that there are two ways to create ethical robots, ideally. One is an explicitly ethical robot. And what I was about to say was that there is a disadvantage with programming a robot with the ethical rules that it has to follow. And the disadvantage is mostly in that its flexibility for dealing with novel situations. Ethical dilemmas, almost by definition, are often ill-defined. And oftentimes we have to apply a higher level of reasoning to solve these sort of ethical situations. A robot that has been completely pre-programmed to the set of rules that it has to follow is limited in its ability to reason through new or unforeseen dilemmas. So that leads us to a second type of ethical robot, something that's called implicitly ethical robots. These are robots that learn their ethical rules from a group of people around them. So they do social learning to learn what's right and what's wrong. Now, the advantage of that is they can be more flexible. They don't have a preset grouping of rules. Their rules can be learned, adapted as the social group changes. The downside of that is you may have some brutally unethical robots if they're trained that way by bad people.
So, and I think of a movie that came out a number of years ago. I think it was an Asimov short story that spawned it called AI. And there was three caveats. I think that, basically harm no humans, don't harm yourself, and be socially responsible. So or don't lie. And is there any consensus on what those fundamentals look? We have a consensus more or less, I think, for human actions. I mean, if religious tenets, then there the Ten Commandments or some other model for ethical and moral behavior. Ought there be a list of commandments for robots?
It's interesting. I mean, a lot of people do point to Asimov's 3 rules as sort of the basis for what a robotic ethical underpinning should be. Something like don't harm humans, don't deceive humans, along those lines, don't lie to humans. The problem with those types of rules tends to be that how do you define harm, for example? If I have to give you a shot in order to make you better, have I violated one of the rules? If I have to lie to you in order to get you out of a burning building, have I violated one of those rules? It's difficult to imagine a sort of really well-defined set of rules for robots. I mean, if you look at the Ten Commandments, for example, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery, and so on and so forth. A lot of them, admittedly, don't apply to robots. And some of the ones, such as thou shalt not kill, there are exceptions for people in certain environments. And so it may be a matter of understanding what the exceptions for robots are.
And are those exceptions? You mentioned too. You mentioned ethics by choice, learned ethics, or pre-programmed ethics as the kind of the. And I don't want an opinion here. In your experience, which is going to be a more successful approach when we're talking about things like making choices, making ethical choices. I have a robot whose intention is to be a firefighting robot and running into, or dashing into a burning building to save somebody. At what point is that something that ought to be hardwired or something that is a decision?
So in my experience, what will probably be the most successful will be a combination of the two types. Something where you have some notional rules that are followed but are adapted based on experience, social interactions, in-group, out-group dynamics. Because ultimately you still have to deal with those two problems. One is that there should be some fixed set of basic morals, and two, you still need the flexibility to deal with new situations.
Do we want robots to look like robots, or do we want them to look like us?
So the question there is about anthropomorphism, and
yes, absolutely. And where are we headed? I mean, I think this is an important question. I know that some friends of mine in Chicago, when I was still in grad school, had a robot that was cleaning the apartment, and it was basically a flat disk, and it was a robot, and it did a very efficient job of finding the dust balls and so on. But it was a robot. Are we steering toward? Are we guiding toward focusing on the anthropomorphism of robots, or are we going to continue to develop robots that are easy to discern as robots?
I think it'll depend on the robot's role. Robots that operate in one's home, robots that operate in healthcare, robots that interact with people on a regular basis, and their role and job is to interact with people. Those robots will tend to be anthropomorphic for the simple reason that we communicate more easily with things that are like that. And as long as you can't presuppose that the person's an expert, then you need a means of sort of generalized communication. So anthropomorphism will be around for a long time. It will be probably advanced for robots that interact with in education, help teach children, robots that interact in your home, robots that take care of you, things like that. Other robots that are simply tools, manufacturing pieces, autonomous driving vehicles, will probably not be anthropomorphized.
I would caution to observe that some of those robots are not going to be, truly autonomous or self-aware. A self-driving car is going to have a set of rules. You don't think?
Yes, okay. It absolutely will.
So when I think, and I'm asking this question toward a subset of robots then, and those are the robots that you are focusing on as social beings, interacting, whether it's in a medical environment, a scientific environment, a classroom, or I've seen robots recently working with autistic children. Mm-hmm. And, I want to ask you about that. What is the dilemma there about robots teaching our children?
Do you want me to answer now or after the break?
Absolutely.
Okay. There are a number of dilemmas. One is that there's a possibility of mechanistic dehumanization, that as we're taught and the more that we interact with robots, the more we become robots, the more we pick up a robot's social character. Psychologically, we as humans have a tendency to reflect the people we interact with. We pick up their parts of speech, we pick up their mannerisms, we pick up their social behaviors. Now, if that becomes a robot, then there's a risk, especially for young children, that they may become more robot-like.
Hold hold that thought, Ellen. We're going to go to commercial break right now. With me this hour, Dr. Ellen Wagner. We are talking about robotics. This is On the Edge, Conversations in ... I'm Dr. Jonas Moses, and stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Okay, very good. You got 30 seconds.
Okay, Ellen, this is a really important conversation, I think, because as you've just brought up, I have 3 young daughters. I have 3 21-month-old daughters, triplets. And when I think about some of their toys that are kind of interactive, that's one. But they stimulate the behavior of their toys and make noises like their toys. There's a toy they have that repeats back to them what they're saying with a very high-pitched voice, and then like the toy. So I do want to talk about that because I think that's a very important issue. I'm going to guess that where are we, John? About 15 seconds?
10 seconds.
10 seconds.
Okay, all right.
10. Take it when you're ready. About 5 seconds.
Thank you. Welcome back to On the Edge, Conversations in ... I'm Dr. Jonas Moses, and with me this hour, Dr. Ellen Wagner, and we are talking about robotics. And we went to commercial break in the middle of a sentence. Ellen was actually talking about robots teaching our young children, and I think this is a very important conversation. Please continue.
What I mentioned was that keeping by nature, it's actually a phenomenon called the Michelangelo phenomenon, is that we learn to interact, we mold our own social behavior from those that we interact with around us. We pick up parts of speeches, mannerisms, bodily postures, all of the above. And as our children interact with robots, there's a very real possibility that they could start to show what's called mechanistic dehumanization. They become more like the robots they interact with. They perhaps show less emotion. Even more of a concern is they may be less able to recognize true human emotion, which is, of course, a very important social task. There's been some recent research that's shown that students in America today, their empathy has dropped quite a bit over the last 20 years. I think it was about, I might be misquoting, but the empathy today of a 11 or 12-year-old is the equivalent of a 9-year-old 20 years ago. It's unclear why that may be, but there are theories out there that use of cell phones, use of texting, these types of things are causing children to sort of lose their ability to recognize empathy and to deeply relate to people around them. And if we're going to have robots in their educational environment, that's a risk we run.
I suppose that after a fashion, that you're successfully raising your children to be empathetic and sensitive when they model certain behaviors. And I wonder if that isn't, I think, for example, I have 3 21-month-old daughters. And one of my daughters, if I get, when I'm holding her, if I get distracted at all, she takes her hands and puts them on my face and says, look at me, okay? Focus on me. And that's her saying to me, without being able to verbalize it, I want your attention. Pay attention to me. And so I wonder if that isn't something that we integrate into those interactions, that when we are able to, that we can anticipate those negative repercussions before they become problems. And is that something that you then build into the robot educator, the robot companion, saying, okay, I hear you talking like I am talking. Why are you doing that? Are you teasing me, or have I had a negative impact? So that we build that into the self-awareness. We somehow incorporate that as a feedback you know, where the robot becomes a mirror of human behavior. It says,
So
are you sure that you're behaving the way a human would behave, or are you trying to behave like I am?
So that type of behavior is certainly very interesting, but it's also very, it seems quite a bit like an ethical slippery slope, right? In that case, we're sort of using human psychology to elicit attention mechanisms through this artificial device. And there's a concern there. There's a manipulation concern, right? We could have robots that cry and act a great deal like children. The question is, you know, are we manipulating the people's own psychology? And is that okay? Now, I should point out that culturally, different regions, different countries view this issue very differently. Europeans are very concerned about it. Americans, I would say, are very concerned as well about the possibility of the emotional and psychological manipulation of people by robots. East Asia and Japanese seem much less concerned about it, and they seem to embrace the possibility of robots acting very much like humans, even if they have no necessary biological underpinnings for the emotions they're presenting.
Okay, so at what point do we cross that line? Because there's a line that I draw between a self-aware or an autonomous robot and a cyborg. And just to define, a cyborg has human components and potentially even a human intellect, but it has biological aspects. I don't know if this is another conversation or a part of this conversation, but is this something that you are discussing when you think of autonomous robots? Are you making that next step to cyborgs?
Yeah, well, in the class that I'll be teaching, we do look at cyborgs, and we look at this possibility of human augmentation through mechanical means, mechanical and electrical devices. So, for example, and at this point, by far the largest sort of cyborg-like devices are prosthetics, which are simply restorative. And I don't want to offend people that have prosthetics. My point is not prosthetics, it's more enhancements. The possibility of creating limbs that outperform normal human limbs, and that people will choose to have their limbs removed in order to have devices installed. It's actually a concern as well with athletics. There's a possibility of people using a new type of electronic doping, if you will, like using electronics for faster reaction time, more efficient motion, things like that. There's even a company which has begun, which offers its employees a chip that they can install that they use instead of key cards. They just use the chip on their hand to open doors. Although it sounds like many of the employees have actually enjoyed this slight cyborgization.
And we're going to a commercial break in just a moment here, but when we get back, I think it would be useful to differentiate between something that's an implant and something that is, truly this kind of robotic cyborg conglomeration. You are watching On the Edge, Conversations in ... I'm Dr. Jonas Moses, and this hour we are with Dr. Ellen Wagner talking about robotics. It's an intriguing conversation, so stay in your seats, and we'll be right back.
Very good, gentlemen. You got 30 seconds.
This is the last segment of the show.
Yes, it's you'll have about 10 minutes after it's over. In 30 seconds, okay. You'll have 10 minutes.
Alan, I don't know if you know where I'm going with this, but we are talking about implanting things that augment, enhance, and enable like that. I'm not sure that that's robotic. So I want to make sure that but I'm going to let you differentiate for us, okay? So we have about 10 seconds, and when we get back, I'll bring that up.
Okay, 10 seconds. Take it when you're ready.
Welcome back to On the Edge, Conversations in ... I'm Dr. Jonas Moses. With me this hour, Dr. Ellen Wagner. We are talking about robotics. This is the last section of our show. So if we run out of time, we'll ask Dr. Wagner to join us again in another show. Alan, I was just before the commercial break asking you to differentiate between something that's a chip implant and something that actually augments us in some way that might be considered robotic or a cybernetic augmentation. Can you help us with that?
Absolutely. So robotic augmentation tends to be electromechanical in nature, often and most typically to replace limbs, hands, things like that. Most recently, there's been a lot of work also in connecting with the person's neural system. So there's been some recent work that has shown individuals using their own neural system to control robotic arms, to pick things, to move things around. And this work is moving very, very quickly from what I've heard. There's also a little bit of work exploring chips in the retina and potentially robotic bionic eyes.
Correct. And I actually did some of that work during graduate school and since then. Augmentations, enhancements that are interactive but static. They don't really control the environments. They are receptors or they facilitate. And that isn't really what we're talking about here. I just want to clarify that for the audience in this particular show. So the question is, when these enhancements become enhancements of not just physical ability, but intellectual capacity.
So that's interesting, an interesting topic. There has been a bit of research about the possibility of using neural interfaces directly with chip implants on a person's head. But probably the most successful work has been the use of chip and radio receivers in the person's head to translate neural activity and record it outside the person, which can then, in theory, be fed back. But I would point to a very interesting recent paper that came out, I think it was out of MIT, where they showed that they could use technology to read the thoughts of a mouse and artificially replace those thoughts in another mouse. I believe this was with regard to a navigation task, but it was a little while ago. Now,
I recall that article.
Yeah, something like that could be done with a human. It's very Matrix-esque.
Well, and you know, I'm not sure that is science fiction. I just read an article that one group is intent upon being able to develop technology that would allow people to read each other's thoughts. And they've actually given it, you know, by 2022, we're going to be able to do this. At what point then, you know, we're using live cockroaches and other insects as drones and robots? You know, are those classic examples of autonomous robots?
So
affecting the control mechanisms of lower life forms and who knows, even other people.
Right, so that's an interesting topic. So the question of using electronic mechanical means to control a cockroach's nervous system, for example. DARPA has had research in that area, and that work has been done. I mean, they've shown that you can have computational electronic control or a biological system in the form of a cockroach in these types of environments. Now, nothing has been, explored, as far as I know, to the extent of a human, any type of human control within these types of systems. And humans, of course, tend to be many orders of magnitude more complex from a neural standpoint than a cockroach. Nevertheless, nevertheless, some of the same principles could in theory apply.
But what would you then define these controlled insects and lower animal life forms as robots?
I would call them cyborgs, a mixture of biological and robotic technology.
So that crosses that line. So they are at that point cybernetic organisms. And are there a set of rules and ethical standards that control what's acceptable use of these and implementation of these?
I'm not quite sure how far the ethical rules have been developed with regard to the creation of cybernetic organisms, because it's such a new topic. Bioethics has a long history and a deep history, both in terms of genetics, surgery, going all the way, of course, back to the Hippocratic Oath. Robotics is by far comparatively new. And so it doesn't really have the sort of depth of ethical standards that biology and, of course, medicine has. Now, when those two become mixed, it brings up an interesting question. Do the biological ethical norms apply? Do the robotic ethical norms apply? Or do you need some sort of novel mixture of the two? Or is it a completely new problem that just needs to reinvent the wheel? That question really hasn't been deeply explored. That's my knowledge.
And I think that, honestly, we're rapidly approaching the end. And I would like to invite you back to continue the conversation. I hope you're willing and able. With me this hour has been Dr. Ellen Wagner. Dr. Wagner is an assistant professor of aerospace engineering at Penn State University. He is also a research associate at Penn State's Rock Ethics Institute, and he teaches a course on robots and their role in society and explores the ethical implications of human-drone interactions. It's been a fascinating hour. I just been very excited to have you join us, and I think this is a great first show for the rebooting of On the Edge, and look forward to continued interaction. And I do want you to give some thought to joining us again. You have been watching On the Edge, Conversations in ... I am Dr. Jonas Moses. And in future shows, we welcome input from our audience. So we will do our best to facilitate that, because the platform has advanced and allowed us to have that kind of interactivity. So please stay tuned to the next broadcast of On the Edge.